everybody. Welcome to Medicine and Science on the Pod TV network. I'm Nick Pellebeat. I'll be your moderator for today's show. And today's show, we got some very exciting topics because for the first time, it looks like medicine and politics are mixing. In other words, they're dictating medical decisions from the Tower of Power in Washington, D.C. So we're going to take a look at some of the nominees that we have for these future positions of the CDC. I believe we have Dr. Dave Weldon. We're going to talk to Michael Patmos, who is a physician who's board certified in internal medicine, about his nomination. And then we have another gentleman here I found quite interesting, and his name is Jay Bhattacharya, who has a medical degree and is also a professor at Stanford University. But one of them, and I think this is Dr. Jay, has an issue where he signed the Great Barrington Declaration, which was basically saying you're going to take the people that are immune or have autoimmune deficiencies like myself, asthmatic, and we're going to segregate them away from the regular population, let COVID spread around, and of course, people like me, I wouldn't get sick because I would be isolated. Well, that's a very interesting theory, and of course has no basis in fact, but that doesn't matter. Other people, facts don't matter, as we know. So they had a couple interesting signees. Sonata Gupta from Oxford University, Martin Kulldorff from Harvard University. They all agreed that, well, there's another way to solve COVID, and that's just let everybody get sick, except the sickies, isolate them, and life is good again. Well, that's very interesting. It's called the Great Barrington Declaration, but did it work? Will it work? We don't know, but we have somebody who can give us some insight to us, and this is Dr. Michael Patmos. And Dr. Patmos, I'm very curious about these two nominees because they're going to be leading our health in the next several years. What are your thoughts?
Well, good morning, Nick. Thank you for the invitation, and hello to all the viewers. My name is Michael Patmos. I am a board-certified internal medicine physician with added qualifications in infection control and hospital epidemiology, and I've been practicing medicine almost 44 years. But I have another side to my career. I also have a master's degree in management from the University of Southern California, Marshall School of Business, and I've spent many, many years, over 25 years, in various healthcare organizations as a physician and an executive. I have been a vice president of medical affairs, chief medical officer, health system, corporate CMO, and even a large medical group CEO. In the course of my work, I've been, as an executive, I've had the opportunity to be involved in the recruitment of over 200 physicians and also many senior executives, non-physician executives. I've even participated on a search for a medical school dean. So I've been very much involved with recruiting talent, executive talent, leadership talent, and physician talent for 25 years. Myself, I've also been a candidate many times, and I have a very close working relationship with dozens of executive recruiters. I'm very, very familiar with the process of executive recruitment and have led recruitments of hundreds of positions. So what I want to do is take a look at these two candidates today, Dr. Weldon and Dr. Bhattacharya, set aside their obvious anti-vax positions or maybe their extreme right-wing positions on abortion or whatever, and just focus in on their candidacy for these roles from the perspective of an executive recruiter, and try to provide a fair and balanced assessment. So this begins by looking at the organization. So let's take a look at CDC and look at what CDC is and see whether or not Dr. Weldon has the kinds of qualifications that you would need to lead CDC. What is CDC? It's a branch of the federal government. It's an organization comprised of about 20,000 employees, a federal agency. Its job is to do disease surveillance. What CDC does is they monitor all over the world where diseases are popping up, and then they go and investigate and shut these disease outbreaks down before they spread. Obviously, mostly everything they do relates to infectious diseases because, after all, historically, infectious diseases are the things that have killed most people. So they also are involved. CDC also has a role in public health preparedness, research in these areas, data analysis, Education and outreach. CDC educates providers. They provide policy guidance, and they're very much involved in global health. CDC is a globally active organization with offices and activities in Africa and Far East, everywhere in the world. And they also provide strong support for health equity, because we know that healthcare disparities affecting people differently by race and gender and so forth is an important health issue. So this is what CDC does. So if you are going to design a position description, you're going to build a position description, what would you want for someone who's a leader? Well, I think you would, given this role of CDC, you would want somebody who's an expert obviously in health, someone who either an MD or PhD, someone who has very strong background and experience in disease surveillance, infection protection, infection prevention, infection control, infectious diseases, someone with a strong research base in these areas, someone with experience dealing with epidemics and outbreaks and how to manage an Ebola outbreak, for example. Like just this morning, I was reading there's a mysterious outbreak in Africa. 147 people just died in the last couple of weeks due to fever and headache, and they don't even know what it is. That's what CDC does. They go to Africa, they figure out what that is, and then they clamp down on it so it doesn't spread around the world. You would want somebody who has that kind of experience. And obviously someone who can provide support for health equity. Well, let's look at Dr. Weldon, who's going to be the director of CDC. What are his credentials? Well, he's an internal medicine doctor like me. In fact, he finished his residency the same year I did. He did no more training after that. He's not trained in infectious diseases, epidemiology, infection control, or any of that. After he finished his training, he practiced medicine in the military, I believe the Navy, for a few years to pay back what he owed them for paying for his medical education. Then he went to Florida and he practiced in general internal medicine in Florida for a few years before running for Congress. And he served many years, I think over 20 years, in Congress in the House of Representatives. And I guess he either didn't run again or he got defeated. So he went back to practicing medicine a few years ago. His resume, he has no publications, he has no academic track record, he has no training in infectious diseases, epidemiology, any of the things that CDC does, he has no experience in. Moreover, he has no experience in managing, he has no credentials in management, no experience managing a large organization of 20,000 people. Being a director of CDC is like being a CEO. He has no management experience. And finally, he has no experience inside CDC or inside any federal agency as an employee. So there's a lot of rules and regulations, policies, processes, and procedures that go on in government agencies that he has no exposure to. So if you look at his resume and then you look at what's needed, you say, my God, his resume, admirable though it may be, he's prepared to be a primary care general internal medicine doctor. That's what he's prepared to do. He doesn't have the kinds of qualifications that would be needed to effectively run CDC. You're putting someone in charge of CDC who has no knowledge of what CDC does, how they do it, what they do, or any of the areas of CDC's accountability. Completely, in my opinion, if I were a recruiter and we had this position posted and his resume came before me, I would say, nice resume, but doesn't match the needs for this position. So I would say Dr. Weldon is a completely inappropriate candidate, not disparaging him. He's a fine fellow and a fine doctor. His political positions notwithstanding, he's qualified to be a general internal medicine physician, and that's it. He's not qualified to be CDC director. What about NIH and Dr. Bhattacharya? Well, NIH is a massive organization, 20,000 employees. The purpose of the National Institutes of Health, it is the federal branch that does biomedical research. They do biomedical research, public health research, disease prevention and treatment, health research funding is a very big part of NIH, education and training researchers, policy development, global health. NIH funds research all over the world, and also basic science, support for basic science research, and of course, health equity. Well, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is the nominee to take over NIH. Who is he? Well, he's also got a very impressive background. If you were designing a position description to run the NIH, you would want someone who is a physician highly trained in research, biomedical research, with experience in biomedical research and experience in developing and educating researchers and policy development around biomedical research, and someone who has an established track record as a biomedical researcher. Now, what is biomedical research? Well, let me just sort of paint a picture of what that is. There's two things. There's basic science research. That's like molecular biology, biochemistry. That's laboratory stuff with a pipette, and it's what PhD researchers do in basic sciences. Then there's clinical research, which is clinical trials, which are administered in hospitals and in healthcare settings around the world, like multi-institutional trials. Very complicated processes. You have to have institutional review boards and all kinds of processes that NIH does. And then there's all the funding related to all this, which is awarding grants. It's all very complicated. So who is Dr. Jay Bhattacharya? Well, he's a very highly educated guy. He is a professor at Stanford Medical School, and his title is Professor of Medicine. But if you look at his resume, though he has an MD degree, he did graduate medical school, he didn't do one day of postgraduate training, no internship, no residency, no fellowship, no MD license, not board certified, not board eligible, no medical staff membership, no clinical privileges, no clinical experience at all, knows absolutely nothing about the clinical practice of medicine. Having an MD degree is an entry-level degree. It doesn't qualify you to do anything. You have to have postgraduate training to be able even to get a license. He's not even qualified to get a medical license. As far as a researcher, does he have any training in basic science research? No. Does he have any training in clinical research? No. If you look at his resume, he has a PhD in economics. He all his research, and I've reviewed his bibliography and all his publications. He's got lots of publications, very erudite publications, all on almost entirely all on questions and issues of healthcare economics. He's not a biomedical researcher. He's not a qualified licensed physician. He has no clinical experience. So if you were designing a position description for the NIH, you would want someone who is an expert in biomedical research and who has administered a large organization. Dr. Bhattacharya has no training in management. He doesn't have an MBA or a master's in medical management. He's never run a large organization. He's never been a CEO. And he has no experience in government. So here he is going to take over, basically, effectively, CEO of the NIH with no prior experience managing an organization and completely inappropriate qualifications with respect to biomedical research. So what could go wrong with that? I think, both of these candidates are a complete mismatch. They have fine credentials, but they're not the right credentials for these jobs. I think if you were to ask any executive recruiter about what I'm saying right now, they would say, oh, yeah, there's no way. These guys are not at all qualified. They would never get through the first round of reviews of their CVs. Their CVs are totally inappropriate for these positions. Now, you started in your opening. I just want a couple comments about the Great Barrington Declaration. What is it? The Great Barrington Declaration was cooked up by Dr. Bhattacharya, Dr. Kaldorf, and Dr. Sunitra Gupta. And it was really cooked up in the Oval Office. That was testified to by Dr. Scott Atlas, who was there. They met with Trump, and they needed an alternative narrative because Trump didn't want to continue the shutdowns, the lockdowns. He wanted to reopen the economy because he was worried he was going to lose the election. So they came up with this declaration that basically said, oh, you can reopen the economy. All you have to do is just give the vaccine and focus your prevention efforts, masking, on the elderly and chronically ill. They're the ones who are most likely to die. And let everybody else just get the COVID virus. They'll get herd immunity and everything will go away. That's what they say. We'll have 20,000 to 40,000 deaths and then it will all go away. And Bhattacharya said that. And, although scientists and doctors were appalled by it, many people jumped on board, including Dr. Marty Makary and McCullough, Malone, all these guys. They all jumped on board with this. Trump jumped on board with it, and it became the de facto policy GOP has endorsed. What is with the Great Barrington Declaration? Google it. It's right there. And read it. It's a 2-pager, and there's not one reference. It's primary conclusions, the things that its primary foundational pillars that you should just focus on the elderly and let everybody else get COVID, basically want them infected, let her rip, is not based on any research at all. There's not one reference in this paper, not one. It's not published in any medical journal. It was never subjected to peer review. They cooked it up. It's a 2-pager. They cooked it up in the Oval Office. And now everybody's like citing the Great Barrington Declaration like it's some great piece of science. It's not even have a reference. When you write a paper, you have to have references. So anyhow, I don't think Jay Bhattacharya, based on his education and training, and certainly based upon what he did with the Great Barrington Declaration, is the right fit for NIH. He doesn't have the correct background and credentials. Neither does Dr. Weldon have the correct background and credentials to run CDC. There's other appointees that Trump has made that are similarly unqualified, but we'll leave that for another day. So what happens when you take completely unqualified people and you put them in charge of organizations? Well, most of the time, you ask any executive recruiter, they're going to tank the organization because they don't have any experience. My prediction is that these two guys will make a mess of the NIH and the CDC in short order. A year or two, you're going to see people getting out of those organizations. It'll be people just will ignore what they're saying. It's just going to be a complete mess. It'll result in a gridlock and a dysfunctional. These agencies will become dysfunctional. I think what they're basically going to do is they're just going to impose a political agenda on these agencies that aligns with Trump's best interests. So that's my presentation for today. I don't think either of these guys have the right credentials for the job. You're a recruiter, let's just put you in the position of being a recruiter. Do you think these resumes actually line up with the job description?
No, but here's the problem I've had. I was listening to your conversation, and this is with Jay Bhattacharya, or whatever his name is. Does he hold a medical license? In other words,
No.
Okay.
No.
And the reason why this is important, Dr. Patmos, in law, you can have a JD like I do, but not be admitted to practice law in any state. And I have some friends that are like that. We have some people in our network that have law degrees, but they're not admitted to practice. It's a big difference. I have a law degree, and I am admitted to practice before the United States Supreme Court, the Ninth Circuit, the 11th Circuit, the U.S. Tax Court, and a member of the Florida Bar. If you're not a member of a state bar, you can't even go to court. So what you're telling me is Dr. J, who has, decent academic credentials, if he said, I'm going to practice medicine in the state of California, he could not do that. Would that be correct?
Not only does he not have a license, he's never had a license. He does not qualify for a license because he never did postgraduate medical education. He would need to do an internship at the minimum and then a residency to be able to be qualified for a license. He's not qualified.
In law practice, you have to pass a bar exam to be admitted in the state. Do you have that same requirement in medical practice? Do you have to pass?
You have to do an internship. You have to pass your internship, and that would qualify you at a minimum to get a license and be a GP. But you can't get a job as a GP anymore. You have to do a residency as well.
So you could not hire him to work at a clinic, a medical clinic in California.
He cannot work as a doctor. He has an ornamental MD. There are a lot of, and that's not a bad thing. There are a lot of, like, for example, a lot of malpractice lawyers who primarily are lawyers will have an MD, kind of supplements their knowledge. And a lot of executives, there are MD MBAs. I know many of them who are basically executives who have an MD, but they've never done internships. They're not clinical. Bhattacharya has 0 postgraduate medical education, which means he is completely unqualified to opine as an expert in any medical clinical matter.
That's what I'm saying. I could never have him stand as an expert witness on anything that's clinically.
No, he would not pass the voir dire.
All right. I would have no further questions, Your Honor, at this point in time. I would have disqualified. But let's bring in Rick Rosner and see what he has to say about.
Under Reagan, they started following a strategy of making government incompetent to piss off people at government. First, you break government, then you get people to vote against government. And then Reagan, I think his quote was the goal is to make government small enough you can drown it in a bathtub.
Okay, but in Italy, there's actually, in Siena, there's a painting that says good government and bad government. And what people don't know is you could actually have good government or you could have bad government. You have good government if you get good people that are qualified in these positions. You have bad government if you have bad people who are not qualified. They're in these positions. And this is the problem I'm seeing with this particular administration as we're starting off, that the reward is for politics and celebrities. It's not for competent people, which I would agree, and I haven't hired as many people do, but I've hired hundreds and hundreds of people to work for my companies, from my law practice to my financial service practice. So we review these resumes all the time, and you're looking for really the best and the brightest to fill the position. And when you get these people involved, like RFK heading up, Health and Human Services, who's an environmental attorney, they can't have a worse mismatch than that. Good news, at least they have medical degrees. Bad news is I wouldn't put them on the top of my call list. That's for sure. I don't think they would make the first round.
Think about it this way. Would you get on an airplane, a 747, with a pilot who's not trained? Would you go scuba diving with a scuba instructor who's not certified? Would you have a brain surgery by a neurosurgeon who has no training in neurosurgery? These, running NIH and running CDC are similarly complicated tasks. You can't just put somebody there because you like they'll do what you say politically. You can't just put an obsequious sycophant in charge of a complicated organization and expect a good outcome.
There's very little downside. There's no downside for Trump putting incompetence in these positions, because say it goes very badly. We saw what happened when COVID went very badly. Trump said it, he said, A, it's not bad. A bunch of people believed him. B, not his fault. It's the Democratic governors of states. And so he's got an excuse structure, and he's got tens of millions of people who support him, who are ready to believe whatever explanation. If it happens to go well, great. Trump, one good thing Trump did is is the push to get a vaccine made. Great. But then everything else about COVID, he screwed up.
He's the master of excuses, everything. I know I'm pivoting away from the very vital discussion y'all have been having around the conversation and everything. But one of the things I've been really impressed with, and I know it's not necessarily in your lane of expertise, Dr. Patmos, but it is part of what you do and everything, in the sense of the way of we treat the body and all along those lines and everything. But I am very impressed. Unfortunately, I haven't had to have one as of yet, and I'm very fortunate at the age of early 60s. But I just had a cousin that retired recently from the GBI office because he had, I believe it was hip replacement surgery. And of course, you're not trying to run after bad guys, even bad guys in the fraud division and everything along those lines, if you have got a new hip. But I've also got my brother's girlfriend has a new heart and everything. So I'm just really impressed with the way that we are able to replace body parts in the 21st century. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts around that, because I've had a number of family members that have had everything from hips replaced to hearts to kidneys to a number of other things. I'm going back in the day, those could have been serious death sentences, and they may even shorten some of their lifestyles even at this day and time. But I'm just really impressed with the medical profession and how they're able to replace body parts. So I just wondered your thoughts around that.
Mark, it's so great to hear you say that, because, I've been a doctor 44 years. I started medical school nearly 50 years ago. I've been in this profession for half a century. And over the course of my 50 years in medicine, my God, have things changed, how far we have come. I remember when a gallbladder surgery, we were in the hospital for 2 weeks. Now it's same day outpatient surgery. I remember when cataract surgery, you had to stay in the hospital for a week and with your head in a block and not move your head. Now they do it in an office. I mean, we have come so far. And why have we come so far? Because we have the world's best biomedical research enterprise underlying all of this, the National Institutes of Health. It is a gem worldwide. And to put that organization in the hands of an obsequious sycophant who's an economist, a bean counter with no background in biomedical research, it jeopardizes all the future progress. Right. What will our research enterprise look like if the Office of Government Efficiency, if Elon Musk gets his hands on the NIH? Who knows? I mean, we risk setting back all that progress that you just described.
No, just really quickly, but the counter to that, and I'm not going to contradict myself, but while I'm a fan of the medicine, I am not the biggest fan of big farm, and I know that was part of what even went into the whole conversation around the pandemic and the vaccines and everything, because big farm has got probably one of the biggest lobbies out there and everything like that. And I actually many moons ago worked as a shipping and receiving clerk for Glaxo. At that time, it was Glaxo before it became GlaxoSmithKline, and I've even lost track of what it becomes with all those mergers and everything. And I also briefly worked as speaking of bean counters, as a aspirin counter or some kind of counter. I think it was for Bristol Myers or one of the other big farm companies, because there are a number of those here that exist in North Carolina and everything. So what is your take on the impact of the big farms? Because I do think that sometimes they are the counter argument to the positivity of science and everything, because big pharma has definitely got some major controls in our
economy. The big pharmaceutical companies do have a lot of influence, no question about it. So do big nutraceutical companies have a lot of influence. But I can tell you, as a practicing physician, it doesn't impact me at all, because I never prescribe brand name drugs. I only prescribe generics. If you look at my prescriptions, they're amoxicillin, doxycycline, propranolol, rosuvastatin. I write generics 99.9% of the time. So I don't do anything that benefits big pharma. All the drugs that I write, most physicians never need to write a prescription with a brand name drug, ever. Just generic equivalents for all of it that are dirt cheap and work just as well.
Let's just see your hands. I know we're winding down, but on one of our other shows, we mentioned that and to correct my name, but there is a speed equivalent that you can now get at the pharmacy. And I do not remember the name, Rick, but you know what I'm talking about and everything. So what is this nature? I think it's because it's like
Adderall. You talking?
Thank you, Adderall.
Yeah. Those are drugs they're watered down amphetamine-like drugs, and they're useful for patients with attention deficit disorder. They're given in very low doses. They're controlled substances, and they're all available generically. You don't need to write it. You don't need to write for Adderall. You can write for the generic drug.
No, but it seems like people are getting
let me make one more point about the cost of incompetence, where it costs us time. So say these guys suck, and say they do just and we lost 4 years, like in fighting climate change under Trump. I don't know how much time we lost when the world shut down under COVID. It had to impact scientific medical research. And the four of us here are of the age where we could benefit from getting extra years of life and health from breaking medical research. And if incompetence costs us those years, that stinks.
Yeah. It's going to do that, and it's already doing that. Life expectancy is declining in the United States. We're seeing a resurgence of infectious diseases now that were long gone. In fact, I just saw an ad today from Harvard Medical School for a new course they're offering on resurgent infectious diseases. So the academics are preparing for these diseases to come back. We will soon see. You put Kennedy in charge, and I'm telling you, in a year or two, you're going to see measles, polio, chickenpox, it's all diphtheria. They'll all come back.
We have one pandemic in waiting with bird flu. Bird flu is pandemic among cows. It has a hard time infecting people. There have only been 57 cases in people in the U.S. so far. But the deal with viruses is they have crappy quality control. Every time you assemble a new batch of virus in somebody's body, it has mistakes from the time before, and eventually a mistake will be made that makes it more infectious of humans.
Hey, by the way, I know we're winding down and because it's right at the hour or the 30-minute and everything, but isn't Adderall just another version of no dose? Because I remember when I was in college, kids used to go and get those.
No dose, I think,
they wanted to stay on. They wanted to stay up all day and everything. So it seems like that's just
a version of no dose. Drinking 10 cups of coffee.
No dose is caffeine. You're on the right track, Mark. No dose is caffeine. Caffeine is a weak amphetamine-like drug. What's in Adderall is dexedrine or other amphetamine-like drugs, and they're very low dose, and they're not as it's not like speed that you get out on the street. So But you're right in that regard. And oh, gee, what was I going to say? Oh, I forgot my last train of thought.
Well, it's okay because
about viruses misassembling themselves and
no. Bird flu is now in raw milk. They just took California just shut down a raw milk company because they found avian flu in raw milk. So, Bobby Kennedy,
not just one place, a ton of places that make raw milk.
Yes, it's going to get into the raw milk, and it's going to spread that way. And Bobby Kennedy, just sue Bobby Kennedy when
our job as the media is to keep these people straight, which is a really tough job because the rest of the media isn't doing anything at all in terms of keeping these people in line. So we're going to be reporting on what's going on in the NIH, CDC, and also the person is the head of Health and Human Services throughout the year. And so our viewers will be able to get a good indication whether they're doing their job right or they're not doing their job. In the meantime, we're going to do our job because we're leaving. And we'll see you next week on Medicine and Science.
Bye.